vote, whether Democrat or Republican, is perceived to only advance legislation that aligns with that party's priorities and policy agenda. Why is this bad for elections? Mainly because no matter who casts doubts in our electoral system, voter confidence in the electoral process decreases while voter apathy increases for everyone. When the American people are caught in the middle of political sparring between the parties, we all lose. In my experience in elections...
Ms. Nardine, we're going to ask you just to conclude, to summarize the remainder of your remarks.
It's just 2 more sentences. Thank you so much. I didn't realize I went over. In my experience in elections, and as a faithful steward of this process in Georgia, I have learned that whether a voter votes by punch cards, DRE machines, ballot marking devices, or paper ballots, voter confidence is directly tied to whether a candidate wins. Voter confidence will grow only with complete transparency and the enactment of elections laws reached by consensus and not by party line. I have faith that this can and will happen. Thank you for your time.
Thank you very much, Ms. Nardine. Ms. Willard, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Great. Thank you very much. Thank you, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. It's a wonderful opportunity to be here with you today here in Fulton County. I've got more than 20 years experience both as a candidate. I was formerly a member of the Atlanta City Council, and I was elected citywide as president of the City Council. That would be in the bio that I submitted earlier, but I wanted to make sure that you knew that I've had to be on the same side you had in watching those returns on election night. I've been an advocate for lots of different groups for probably the last 30 years, getting people to vote. And probably most fundamental for me is I'm the daughter of a retired Air Force colonel who spent his career voting from a distance. Now I've been chair of the Fulton County Board of Registration Elections. I'm happy to be here with Dr. Ruth. And I'm glad that she gave you sort of the details about the complexities of voting in Fulton County because we are such a large geographical area and have so many voters. It adds additional complexity. But what I think is really important is that all of us in big counties or small counties are experiencing many of the same things: dramatically increased expenses, challenges hiring staff and recruiting volunteers, and a changing landscape of equipment, software, rules, procedures, and regulations that are generally beyond our control or our input. Now, in Fulton County, we've been blessed with a really productive Board of Elections. Even though we are a bipartisan board, in almost every instance, we've spoken as one voice, and we have found ways to work with each other to identify priorities and to see that those priorities get implemented. So much so that we hired unanimously our newest Director of Elections after a nationwide search. She had a whole year to administer elections as an interim and was observed by our Performance Review Board and the Carter Center to great reviews. So when we hired her with the unanimous vote, we all had the experience and the objective observation to make sure that she was the right one for this important job. Later this month, our department's going to move to a new purpose-built central election facility that will consolidate all of our operations into a single building, and I hope with some notice maybe you'll come back and visit us there. We're very excited about that. And just last month, after a 2-year review of our elections processes, the State Election Board unanimously closed the investigation into our operations. We were happy to participate in that. I will say it was a bit time-consuming for us, but it gave us good advice about things that we could look forward to, improving our work in the future, but also validated what we already know, which is we do great work at Fulton County Board of Elections. In addition, Fulton County's audit department did a full financial audit of us last year and reported back that there were no material issues, and as well that 100% of our equipment was accounted for through our barcode-coded inventory system that we implemented a number of years ago. Senate Bill 202, I'll be quick, I don't have a lot of time, did a lot of things. I'm not sure all of them contributed to the outcomes that were anticipated. The most difficult thing for us were voter challenges in particular. I'm sure we'll get into that in some detail. But after about, I think, maybe 30,000 challenged voters over the course of about a year and a half, no voters were referred to the Attorney General or the Secretary of State for voting illegally. That's an important thing to say. We can talk a little bit about the costs. We can talk about the things that we're already doing, and I look forward to those questions. terms of the Performance Review Board, which was something that came up in Senate Bill 202, I can't say enough that this was a very challenging situation. There were absolutely no parameters for what would be investigated, for how long the investigation would go, for how that would be financed, for what we would be looking for. And it could only be initiated by at least one member of the delegation, which is what happened in Fulton County. But in another county, Coffee County, where there are allegations of criminal misconduct because there's a sole member there who doesn't want a performance review, they have not experienced the same recommendations. They have not experienced the same investigation. So I hope we'll look closely at that. Restrictions on drop box use is a challenge for us. We appreciated getting drop boxes. We're a big county, as Dr. Ruth mentioned, but to reduce it now to 8 for 800,000 voters has created some difficulties for us. Limitations on absentee ballot requests. I wish I could bring my 92-year-old mother here to talk to you about the complications she had. And she's got a daughter who knows about elections, but it was quite daunting. Two things that I want to not forget to talk about. One is that we don't receive federal funding and we receive nominal state funding, and yet we get more and more requirements and regulations heaped upon us, and our taxpayers rightfully complain about the cost of elections. In 2019, our elections cost $2.50 a voter. That's now upwards of $10 a voter. That's just since 2019. We don't get additional funding for that. And then the false and fake commentary about election administration has been very difficult for all of us to do. We all want good elections. I firmly believe that, but it's also a bipartisan responsibility for us all to be truthful and honest and to look very, very clearly at rigorous and objective analysis. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak, and I look forward to your questions.
Thank you very much. We'll now begin questioning our witnesses. Then we'll alternate between parties. In recognition of the gentleman from the home state of Georgia, I will allow Mr. Loudermilk to begin our questions. Mr. Loudermilk.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. Thank you all for being here, panelists, and the folks who have come out to witness your government at work. Because we're doing this here, we probably have 3 times the amount of people that we would have if we were doing this hearing in Washington, D.C. And I appreciate you being here. Now, one thing I do have to comment on is my colleagues on the other side, as you heard, have complained about this being the 9th hearing we've had on this piece of legislation. I think transparency and accountability is good. I think it's something the American people expect. Had we had that to the 2 federal takeover bills, H.R. 1, in the previous 4 years that the Democrats rammed through this committee with barely even one hearing, you would have found out in that a whole lot more about those bills. I think the transparency and accountability is a good thing. Now, before I get into my general questions, I have learned something from my colleagues because this has been a recurring thing by my friends across the aisle at all of these hearings is the discussion about questions of who won particular elections. And I think that's a valid question to ask. So what I'd like to do is ask each of you this question, simple yes or no answer, and then I'll get into my other questions. And I'll start with you, Dr. Ruth. Did Brian Kemp win Georgia's gubernatorial election in 2018 and 2022?
He did.
Mr.
Yes,
Spakowski. Ms. Nerdin?
Yes, sir.
Ms. Woolard?
Yes.
Thank you all. I appreciate that. That's, as you may hear, that question has been asked in another form in past hearings. But let's move on to the context of what we're here about today. And one thing I'll say, look, I appreciate y'all being here. Like many of you, I spent many hours watching the Braves play in this building. Unlike some of you, I actually attended games that were in the building that was across the street. In fact, the first Braves game I attended at 3 years old, and I didn't even remember it. So it's good to be here doing this, and I appreciate everyone being here. Mr. Von Spakowski, good to see you again. Thank you for your continued attending these hearings in the field and in Washington, D.C. Simple question. What were some of the most important and key provisions of SB 202 in your opinion?
I think one of the most important was the extension of the state's voter ID law, which was first effective, as you know, in 2008 in that presidential election. But it only applied to in-person voting. And the state extended it to absentee balloting. They made it extremely easy for people to comply with it. Obviously, it did not in any way hurt turnout. But given the huge increase in the use of mail-in or absentee ballots. Having an ID requirement for that, I think, is one of the most important changes that states can make. And as you know, other states followed Georgia's example, Texas, Florida, et cetera.
I appreciate that. It was interesting is before we started here earlier, I had a member of the media come to me and say, I've been looking over the bill. This seems like something that should be bipartisan. Why is there an argument against Senate Bill 202? What is the argument on the other side? They were honestly asking this question. So in your opinion, what is so controversial about any of the reforms that are in this bill?
Well, I don't think there should be any controversy over them. Look, the biggest complaint or criticism you always hear is that, well, if you require an ID, you're going to suppress votes. We know that's not true. And the reason we know it's not true is we now have turnout data for almost 15 years. And the turnout data overwhelmingly shows it does not suppress turnout. The National Bureau of Economic Research released a study in 2019 looking at turnout across all 50 states from 2008 to 2018 to compare states with ID to other states without ID, and said it clearly has no negative effect overall or for any group defined by age, gender, race, or party affiliation. Just this year, a new study was published in the Proceedings of the National Academy of Sciences, in which they took a look at this claim that has been made by some that, for example, voter ID laws benefit the Republican Party and hurt the Democratic Party because it somehow disproportionately keeps people out of the polls. They studied elections from 2003 to 2020 and looked at state-level races, governor, state legislature, congressional and presidential races. It actually slightly gave an advantage, apparently initially, to Democrats. That disappeared by 2012, according to the study, so it doesn't hurt either party. And in fact, they said the one thing they saw consistently across the board was it increased turnout because it apparently motivates and mobilizes the voters of both parties.
So people from both parties want to make sure that their votes are counted and that
Yes.
their votes matter, and that's why this is important. Mr. Chair, I yield back the time that I have already exceeded, and I hope we have several more hearings on this bill as we go forward because it's very important.
The gentleman yields back. The ranking member of the committee, Mr. Morelli, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I do want to point out one thing which I think is statistically relevant, which is while November 22 turnout numbers were similar to 18, there was a dramatic difference in race. Nearly 9% higher voter turnout among white voters than non-white, and that is higher than any general election disparity in the past decade, roughly 50% higher in the previous two midterm elections. So we actually believe that this new law, SB 2020, has affected turnout. White voter turnout has gone up. Non-white voter turnout has gone down pretty dramatically. If black turnout was the same as white in the last election, 176,000 more black voters would have voted in Georgia. So we think it's the legislation effect is exactly what was intended, which is to reduce turnout among people of color. I want to I'll take Mr. Loudermilk's lead on this. Ms. Willard, did Joe Biden win the 2020 presidential election?
Yes, sir, I was an elector for him.
Ms. Nuruddin, did Joe Biden win the 2020 presidential election?
Yes, sir.
Mr. Van Spakowski, did Joe Biden win the 2020 election?
Yes.
And Dr. Ruth, did Joe Biden win the 2020 presidential election?
Yes.
Thank you. I do want to if I can start, Ms. Willard, one of the provisions in SB 202, that provides for unlimited voter challenges, which is interesting. It allows any Georgia voter to challenge, without any requirement of concrete, as I understand it, or particularized knowledge, the eligibility of an unlimited number of county voters, which I would assume places a significant burden on county boards of elections, because they have to then do an investigation. I think it's within 10 days. So are you able to explain the challenge process and whether or not that does present a burden to election administrators?
Yes, I'll try to do it as quickly as possible. Once we receive notification of a challenge from an individual, and that can come in any way, right? You know, letter over the transom, email, any kind of database, anything. There's no parameters in that legislation. We have 10 days to investigate the claim. We have 10 days. Within that 10 days, we need to set a hearing date, and we need to notify all the people who've been challenged. Now, if you were only getting a challenge of 1 or 2 voters, you might be able to pull that off with some rigor. But if you get a challenge list of thousands of voters, you've got to notify people to come down to a hearing to defend the challenge, regardless of whether you've had the opportunity to sort of clean through that list. We had challenges almost, it seemed like monthly in the last year. As I said, I think 30,000. I didn't have enough time when I got the invitation to verify that number, but it's at least that. Once we do that, then our staff have to go through and look at every single name and address and see what the basis of the challenge was, and then try to ascertain what was required and what to recommend to us. At that point, then we can, you know, if we decide that there's some basis for the challenge on any individual voter, then we can tag them in our database, and they would have to correct the record when they come to vote, if they came to vote.
Yeah, sorry to interrupt you, but
That's right.
If you didn't have voter challenges, what methods would you use as election administrators to ensure integrity of the lists?
Yep, there's quite a few. We get regular monthly updates from the Department of Driver Services of address changes when people come in. And there's a little asterisk to that. We get notification monthly from the Secretary of State's office from, new registrants and address changes that come in through their portal. Sometimes people come to our office or notify us in other ways that they want to change an address, or, come with a list of voter registrations that they've done as part of a voter registration drive. And then most recently, we've used our GIS team as well as an outside consultant to help us update our database in terms of commercial addresses and other things.
So you mentioned 30,000 challenges in Fulton County alone?
Yes.
To your knowledge of those 30,000 challenges, how many were successful?
Well, successful is a little bit of an ambiguous term in this regard.
How many were disqualified?
No one was referred because of criminal activity or double voting or anything like that. There were, I couldn't tell you the numbers, there were people that might have had to do updates to their addresses or things like that as a result of the challenge. And then, in terms of like the pure challenge, and we got lots and lots of feedback about errors alleged or otherwise. Dr. Ruth can recount her experience in being challenged in the aggravation of having your address pulled because you have a geographical quadrant at the end of your address, and someone thought that wasn't something that was appropriate.
Very good. Thank you. Thank you all for being here. I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Mr. Carey from the state of Ohio is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank you for having this field hearing, and I'd also like to thank the ranking member Morelli for having a bipartisan folks up here. It goes without saying, my first election, my first remembering of an election was 1976, and so while we are 3 days late, obviously Georgia and President Carter and Mrs. Carter celebrated their 77th wedding anniversary just 3 days ago. So I know they have some health problems, and just want to make sure we keep them all in our prayers as we go about our day. Mr. Van Spakovsky. From 2020 to 2022 elections, states have utilized something known as Zuckerbucks. Originally, they were meant to help election officials administer elections. Now, some would say they really have been used for partisan get out the vote purposes. Can you talk about some of the effects these Zuckerbucks had in the 2020 election? And do you know how it affected Georgia in any particular way?
Sure. There was about, by the way, my last name is a typical name for somebody from Alabama. There was around $450 million suddenly contributed as tax-deductible donations to a small nonprofit in the past that had a budget of $1 million. And then they suddenly started giving huge election grants to election offices. This has never occurred before in American history. And while they claim it was bipartisan, actually the money overwhelmingly went only to large urban districts that were strongholds for Democratic candidates. They would give very small amounts of money to other more rural counties, but the money overwhelmingly went there. This was a get-out-the-vote effort by moving the hard dollars, which have to be accounted for under federal campaign finance laws. And I used to enforce those laws as a member of the Federal Election Commission. Those hard dollars all have to be reported. But what the Zuckbucks did is use soft money, tax deductible, that didn't have to be reported. It went to large urban Democratic strongholds, and the intention was to use it to get out the vote. Basically moving campaigns, get out the vote operations into these local election offices.
So as a follow-up to that, many states have now banned
Right.
taking Zuckerbucks. Am I correct?
Yes, and they should, because we shouldn't want any partisan political organizations, political contributors. We shouldn't want anybody. I don't care whether they're on the right side, the political aisle, the left side, contributing money to the government officials who are supposed to be administering the election. That should not be happening.
Now, in our legislation, I believe we end this tax exemption that would be given to those organizations. Okay. Mrs. Noureddin, in 2020, Georgia was inundated with mail-in ballots. They were received before the election day and on the election day, in some cases several days after the election. And thank you for your son's service to our country, by the way. Can you talk a little bit about your experience on the board receiving ballots after the election day had passed? And we only have a minute, so.
Can you check your microphone?
If you're asking if it occurred, yes, it did.
Well, let me ask you this. So realistically, and again, we only have about a minute, realistically speaking, when should the cutoff day be for a jurisdiction to receive a mail-in ballot?
Election day.
It should be election day. Do you think it, in any way, shape, or form, decreases voters' confidence in our election process when election boards are receiving ballots weeks after the election?
Well, unfortunately, they can't control the ballots that come in late.
Yeah.
So what's your question relating to late ballots?
Just in general. I mean, do you think that voters will view that if ballots are coming in weeks and weeks afterwards, that do you think that lessens voters' confidence in the election process?
I think if a person believed that they voted an election and didn't, it would negatively impact the confidence of all of us.
Okay. Well, I want to thank all the witnesses for coming here today, and I think you've done a very good job so far. So thanks so much. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Gentleman yields back. Ms. Sewell is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I want to thank everyone for being here today. I have the great honor of representing my hometown of Selma, Alabama, where John Lewis and so many amazing foot soldiers shed blood on a bridge in that hometown for the equal right of every American to vote. I think that I agree wholeheartedly that the issue of voting and election reform should be bipartisan. It shouldn't be partisan. And I am honored every day to carry the seminal piece of legislation, the John Robert Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act, which would actually restore the full enforcement of and protections of the Voting Rights Act of 1965. You know, what I think is most distressing is that we focus on the turnout numbers. And Ms. Bullard, I know that all eyes were on Georgia during the 2022 both midterm as well as the presidential election. And there were great turnouts. But as my colleague pointed out, many of those turnouts were disproportionately by white voters, not black voters. And can you talk to us a little bit about the impact of that? See, I truly believe that that it wasn't because of SB 202, but rather it was in spite of 202 African American voters came out and voted in record numbers. Can you share a little bit about what you think the impact of 202 was with respect to voter turnout and voter access?
Well, it's a big question. I think those numbers speak for themselves. You know, we've had very exciting elections in the last few years here in Georgia, and lots and lots of attention, lots of money has come into the state to mobilize voters. All of those things are not things I've participated in recent years. I think that some of the things that we've seen in terms of lack of access to the drop boxes created lines and congestion around our polling places.
Wasn't it true that in the areas, the counties that African Americans mostly live, Fulton, DeKalb, and Gwinnett, had a reduction of drop boxes from 37, 33, and 24 respectively to 8, 5, and 6? Doesn't that mean that African American voters have to either wait in longer lines or have a more difficult time getting to the polls?
Well, I think those numbers are correct, and I think it makes it difficult for everybody to have the opportunity to vote. I think that the changes in when people can apply for absentee ballots disproportionately impacted people who have challenges already in terms of getting those things out, you know, not connected to the internet, maybe having some difficulty in just understanding how to process these many, many different changes that go on. And, you know, you chip away at those things little by little by little, and then it tends to add up.
I also think that the 202, SB 202, also has a election reform provision that allows the state to take over county boards of elections if they see fit. Dr. Roof, do you think that that is a reform that should be nationalized? I think that my colleagues with their American Confidence in Elections Act is trying to really nationalize a lot of these voter suppressions. Can you give us any insight as to whether or not it's necessary for states to take over county boards of elections?
I think it's important that elections are run at the local level with guidance from the state and oversight from the state, but not takeover. We experienced that with Georgia and Fulton County, and what I appreciate from the board is we work together in a bipartisan way to ensure that in the oversight of elections, working with our department to ensure that we were in compliance. And so the performance review was very helpful for us, I would say, in ensuring that we are addressing the errors, the inconsistencies, and making sure that we're updating our systems and
Thank you. I just want to reclaim my time. I want to enter for the record a unanimous consent to enter the Brennan Center for Justice's December 2022 report, Georgia's Racial Turnout Gap Grew in 2022. Can I please?
Without objection.
In conclusion, I just want to say, Mr. Chairman and Ranking Member, I do believe that we should be trying to work together, Democrats and Republicans, to do election reform. I think all of us can see that there are holes and gaps in the process, but I think that in doing so, what's really also important is that we increase voter access to the ballot box, that we're not intentionally or unintentionally, inadvertently making it harder for certain populations to vote. I think that that's why we see so much polarization when it comes to that. But I want to just end by saying that I think that we would all do a lot if we could sit down at a table together and really honestly talk about election reforms. I hope that Chairwoman Lee and I can do that sometime very soon. Thanks.
The gentleman yields back. The gentlewoman from Oklahoma and the chair of the Subcommittee on Modernization, Ms. Bice, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for the witnesses for being here. I want to piggyback off of what my colleague, Representative Stoll, just mentioned. You know, she's right. This should not be a partisan issue, but I think it has become that due to the lack of engagement from the Republican side during the last Congress, where I was a freshman member, as the John Lewis Voting Rights Act was pushed forward. There was no engagement from the Republican side, no even input or discussion, and that does make it difficult. So I agree with you. We should have more dialogue on this issue. I want to start with Mrs. Nuruddin. Thank you so much for your son's service and for your service to your community. I want to thank you for explaining the challenges that you face during the 2020 election honestly. And that's really why we have Senate Bill 202 and also the ACE Act being put forward. Ranking Member Morelli suggested earlier, and I think Representative Sewell as well, that there was voter suppression by race in the 2022 election due to the passage of Senate Bill 202. Would you agree with this assessment?
I think that the struggle
Can you
Check your
make sure to hit your, there you go.
doing that, sorry guys.
It's okay.
I think that the struggles that impact families who are living in perpetual poverty, I think that Senate Bill 202 didn't change the reality for those voters.
Did they expand early ballot access? Was the time early voting expanded with Senate Bill 202?
It was, I think the Saturday and Sunday was added maybe, or was it there before? Well, yeah.
Okay.
So the
Anyone else?
Saturday was optional before, but now it's required for federal elections, and Sunday is optional based on superintendent.
So we've actually expanded the number of days that individuals have to vote. Dr. Reith, do you want to comment on that at all?
No, just, I agree.
Agree, okay.
That's true.
Thank you.
Sunday is optional.
Sure. Ms. Willard, I want to follow up on Mr. Carey's line of questioning. You mentioned that you receive no federal funding, very little state funding. How are you funding your operations? Are you taking any money from outside entities to help run these elections?
We've not, since I've been on the board, they might have prior to 2020, but not in the last 3 years.
So how are you funding your operations?
Local county taxpayers pay the operations fully.
Okay. You also mentioned, and I think it's important to note this, that there are geographical challenges with Fulton County. And I just thought it was an interesting sort of perspective here. So I looked it up. And you may be surprised to know that Fulton County is 534 square miles. Oklahoma County, my home county, is 718 square miles. We don't have ballot boxes at all. We have no fault absentee ballots, where you have to have an absentee ballot notarized before you send it back in. We have voter ID laws on the books, but we also can determine the night of the elections who has won. And so I'm not sure that the geographical size of the county matters. It's really how these elections are being administered that make the huge difference. And I think it's an important point to note. One of the tenets of the ACE Act is cleaning up the voter rolls. And I maybe want to ask Mr. Spiskowski, who do you think in the U.S. is doing voter maintenance well in the United States? What states are doing well?
Well, the easiest way to find out who's doing it well and who's not is to check the election integrity scorecard that the Heritage Foundation premiered in December of 2021, in which we rate every single state based on best practices.
Do you think that states like California that have decided to do mail-in balloting to everyone, and I think we've talked here, I think it even happened recently in some other states.
Well, I'll tell you, on
including
voter
DC.
registration maintenance, California is one of the worst states in the country, so is Nevada. Some of the best states in the country are places like Texas, Georgia, Florida, but you can see our ratings. I will tell you this. We scored states based on a perfect score of 100. No state in the country scored 100. The highest state was in the low 80s. The worst states would have flunked out of college. Their scores were so low.
I think just the last point I want to make is that's why this particular piece of legislation is so important. We want to improve the process. We want to make sure that we have accurate, reliable, trustworthy elections at the end of the day, and this legislation aims to do that very thing. So I thank the witnesses for being here. Mr. Chairman, I yield.
Gentleman yields back. Congresswoman McBath is now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman. Thank you so much, Ranking Member Morelli, and all of the witnesses that are here today. We really appreciate you. And I just want to say in response to my Republican colleague, it always matters with the closing of our polling stations and the number of drop boxes that we have here in Georgia. Specifically, we saw a great number of individuals that had great difficulty in actually being able to exercise the right to vote. So yes, those things do matter. But I just want to say that I was born in Joliet, Illinois, in the heart of the civil rights movement. My father was the town's only black dentist, and my mother was a registered nurse. And they cared for people. By day, they worked to heal the sick bodies and mend the broken bones, but by night, they worked to treat the ills of a different kind. They were civil rights advocates fighting to inspire spirits that had long been battered and bruised. My father was the Illinois branch president of the NAACP, and in our household, it was expected that from the moment that we could walk, we would be marching and fighting for civil and human rights as well. We marched alongside our parents in the baking summers and the frigid winters, and I often joke and say the first song I ever learned to sing was "We Shall Overcome," because we were always singing that song. And I learned that we are not to be afraid, and I also know that deep in my heart, we truly will overcome. I'm a daughter of the civil rights movement, and I'm a daughter of this country. And when you live a childhood that is dedicated to the fight for justice, the right to vote becomes sacred. It becomes your voice when there are those who seek to silence your voice. And it was in my lifetime that literacy tests and poll taxes continue to disenfranchise the descendants of slaves. And even with all the gains that we have made, it's clear that this work is far from over. Because each and every one of us has seen the lines on Election Day, particularly here in Georgia, the lines on Election Day extending around the block. Each and every one of us in the state of Georgia has seen state legislatures who have passed restrictions that make it harder for communities of color to vote. Each and every one of us, in particular here in Georgia, has seen polling places disappear in black precincts, drop boxes cut in areas with more black voters. And food and water has been banned as black voters wait in longer and longer lines. Once again, we move forward in our efforts to make it easier to vote, and we look back to find guidance from those who fought so similar a struggle, such as our beloved John Lewis. Ms. Woolard, I have questions for you. The State Election Performance Review Board recently conducted an in-depth and lengthy assessment of elections administration in Fulton County. This was part of a process instituted by SB 202 that could have led to a state takeover of elections administration in Fulton County. And as I understand it, the Performance Review Board concluded that a state takeover would not be helpful. Is this correct?
That's correct.
In your opinion, was the cost in time and money of the review for Fulton County an effective use of taxpayer resources?
No, I don't think so. And I think if you were to ask the members of the Performance Review Board, they were quite frustrated as well, because they were volunteers and they were required over the course of about 2 years to spend quite a bit of their time, in addition to their service on their local election boards, to follow us around and do work. I think if one were to do something like that, I will echo Dr. Ruth's comment that taking over a board is really not to be the outcome one should look at. But if you were to do something like this, to have very, very clear guidelines about time frame, what you're investigating, why you're investigating, and what would prompt it, and it can't be politicized, where in one county an investigation gets triggered on the basis of really people's public perceptions, whereas in another county where there's criminal activity being alleged and there's no performance investigation happening.
Okay, thank you. So it seems that fighting off a partisan-inspired takeover attempt must have monopolized an incredible amount of time for Fulton County elections administrators such as yourself. Did this impact the ability of the county to perform other really vital election duties, or indirectly danger or hamper the ability of Georgia voters to have access to the ballot box?
You know, I think one of the things that I learned as being the chair of this board was that a lot of the effort that I needed to put into my work and the work of our board was to find ways to preserve time for our staff to do the work that they needed to do. The work that they don't need to do, the voter challenges, the performance review, multiple performance reviews and audits, the open records requests, the lawsuits, the subpoenas, the depositions, those are things that get in the way of us doing the complicated logistics of managing an election.
Thank you. Now yield back.
The gentlewoman yields back. The gentlewoman from Florida, the current chair of the Subcommittee on Elections, and the former Secretary of State of Florida, Ms. Lee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. Mr. Von Spakowski, I'd like to start with you today. One provision of the ACE Act that we haven't discussed yet today is the use of the existing Election Assistance Commission, a bipartisan group, to provide a forum to share best practices with states around the country, covering things such as audits, certification and testing of election systems, chain of custody, and other basics that are really essential to effective elections. Would you share with us why you believe doing that, the sharing of those best practices, is important?
Well, that's the way election officials improve. I mean, look, we have the most decentralized election system of any Western democracy. It's run, as you well know, down at the county government level. Secretaries of State oversee that, but it's really county government officials, all the folks sitting at this table. They're the ones that are doing voter registration and running the polling places. So we have literally thousands of local election officials, and sharing best practices is the best way to improve our elections. And that includes things like, look, one of the things this bill does is it makes it clear that HAVA funds can be used for post-election audits. That is vitally important. Financial and accounting audits are ubiquitous in the business world. Every business, every corporation, nonprofits have to undergo audits, and yet they are virtually non-existent in the election area. Every state needs to put in a system for comprehensive post-election audits that don't just recount ballots to make sure that the hand count agrees with machine count, but to go through the entire system and make sure that all state and federal laws were followed, individuals were able to access the polling place and vote properly, that complaints, when they were filed, were properly heard and taken care of. All of that needs to be audited, and only a handful of states have started doing that. Providing federal funding is very important for that.
And on that subject, Ms. Woolard, I'd like to return to a line of questioning that you had with the Ranking Member Morelli, where you discussed the challenges at a local election office that you have in addressing and responding to public inquiries about voter eligibility. And I will tell you, as a former elections official, I want to acknowledge that I understand that's a real challenge. You have a finite set of resources, a finite number of employees, and certainly in Florida, we too were subject to many inquiries, many lawsuits, and things of that nature. But I'd like to hear from you how you would suggest then that we balance the needs of elections offices with those of the public, who in many cases have well-founded concerns, maybe have done their own research, identified things on the voter rolls that give them concerns. I know we all share a desire for the public to have confidence in our elections and our outcomes and the strength of those voter rolls. So how would you suggest that a citizen, a member of the public, who has concerns can get those concerns about the eligibility of voters addressed?
Well, if you were to continue along the vein of the voter challenge law that we have right this minute, I think there should be some real guardrails about how many times any particular individual could make a challenge and how many challenges they could make and the form in which that challenge would be made. I think I would really appreciate it if the audience wouldn't speak while I'm trying to answer. It's quite distracting. So I think that, that's the fundamental problem. When we receive a list of 10,000 voters and it's 3,000 of whom had a geographical reference to their address, which everyone in the city of Atlanta has, but yet it triggers us having to respond in 10 days, it's quite distracting.
But in the event that, because of course some groups and some individuals are much more dedicated to this than others, and so there will be some groups and some individuals who have a higher number of these challenges. And I think one of our obligations as elections officials is to find a way to be sure that we're responsive to the public. And so where they have concerns, whether it's one concern or 1,000 concerns, that we're finding a way efficiently as elections officials to hear them and address those concerns. So, you know, one of the questions I know that has been discussed is, should that be at the state level as opposed to the local election? But I don't think we can take the position that we're simply not going to respond, or that we're not going to respond because the requests are too numerous. Dr. Ruth, let me ask you the same question. What are your thoughts on how we can be communicating back with the public who have concerns about the integrity of our rolls, that election officials are hearing them and addressing those concerns?
And so I think there are two things, and I think Hans touched on one, and that is best practices. And so one of the things is really understanding how are other states dealing with challenges. New Hampshire has that law in particularly. And also the spirit of the law. I think it's also important for the department to put into place a criteria for hearing challenges that can be posted on the website so that persons who are submitting challenges, that they understand what the criteria is. It is up to the person submitting the challenge to provide the preponderance of evidence.
Thank you. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
The gentlewoman yields back. The gentlewoman from Georgia, Ms. Marjorie Taylor Greene, is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and thank you for letting me sit in on the committee today and participate. I thank our witnesses and everyone here that's come to the committee hearing. Elections have consequences, and certainly we are living through the consequences. We have wide open borders with over 5.3 million people who have attempted to come into our country. Fentanyl is now the #1 cause of death of young people from ages 18 to 45. We also have the very unfortunate circumstance of possibly moving towards World War III with the escalation of the war in Ukraine and the United States backing it. And then something I care a lot about is our kids. Unfortunately, there is a trans ideology that is coming after our children, and I think that's something. So elections have consequences, and the 2020 election had consequences. And according to polling as recent as June 2023, only 32% of all voters, Republican, Democrat, Independent, believe that there was no cheating in 2020. So this is a very important hearing, and this is an important bill that is being presented before you. And in coming up on the 2024 election, 54% of all voters expect voter fraud. So I'm very glad to be participating. For my role in the ACE Act, I've introduced the District of Columbia Voter Identification Act, which will be an important piece of this package, hopefully to be brought forward as a model for all states. This requires voter ID, and the reason why we introduced this is because in the District of Columbia, they wanted to let anyone vote, foreigners, illegals, anyone that lived in the District of Columbia, including foreign nationals, diplomats, and that shouldn't be happening. So there will be no illegal aliens voting, and I think that's important. And also, it requires ID, and ID is important. It requires driver's licenses, a passport, military photo ID, student ID, or the last 4 digits of the voter's social security number. This is an important issue because ID is required not only for many things like buying alcohol if you're 21 years of age, but also to receive SNAP benefits, which many poor people unfortunately do have to receive. They also have to prove identity, ID, like a social security number. I don't think ID is a race issue. ID is part of being a U.S. citizen, and it should be a requirement to vote. And this is something that should be required for everyone. So I don't think there should be any partiality or be considered racist. So I'd like to ask our panel here, Dr. Ruth, do you consider IDs to be racist?
I do not.
Okay. Mr. Spakowski?
I do not. And I do not, and the evidence shows they're not.
Okay. Ms. Nureddin?
Microphone.
I believe ID is important. I agree, definitely. However, there must be a reasonable remedy for people who are challenged in this way. What I fear is that someone who's eligible to vote, who may not have ID, can't. And so, no, I don't want non-citizens.
But it's not racist, as long as everyone's able to get an ID. Thank you, Ms. Nureddin. Ms. Woodward? I'm sorry, Ms.
Woolard. It's Woolard. By definition, IDs can't be racist, but I do think that the lack of IDs in a county like Fulton County, where we have the highest level of income inequality in the country, presents certain challenges for people.
Ms. Woolard, it could only be racist if we're identifying someone's skin color, not their citizenship in the country. Thank you for answering my question. Now, another thing to talk about for the state of Georgia is the fact that my former husband was told when he went to vote in 2020 that he had already voted by absentee ballot. He never requested an absentee ballot form. He never turned in an absentee ballot to vote, and he wanted to vote in person. He was forced to sign an affidavit at that time, surrendering a ballot he never voted on in order to vote in person in the 2020 election. He was called a liar. I was called a liar. He hired an attorney, did a FOIA request, and it proved after the FOIA and all the work was done, there was never an absentee ballot turned in his name, never a request form with an envelope turned in his name. But the Secretary of State said that he voted by absentee ballot, and the Secretary of State has never answered our question on why that's happened. So I just wanted to state that for the record today. There's definitely problems in elections. SB 202 has done a great job in turnout, giving a 57% higher than national midterm average of 52%. But there definitely is a cause, and this is why people are here, and they care about our elections. Thank you very much.
Thank you. The gentlewoman yields back. Mr. Collins from the state of Georgia is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And I couldn't help but to notice you mentioned the Braves, but as being a good citizen of the 10th District, we have the Georgia Bulldogs that are back-to-back.
Bulldogs.
Maybe a three-peat, and you can mention that when you come back in the fall. Wait a minute now, I've got time going here. Folks, this is my first time being elected. I'm a freshman in Congress, but I've spent many years in county politics as a county chairman. So I've worked those polls, and I had to work them personally because I know how hard it was to get people to show up to work the polls. And that was the case. Now, it's not anymore, but that was the case. And I want to focus on a couple of things that I don't think we've touched on too much today. And Mrs. Spakowski, I'd like to focus on cleaning up our voter rolls. And I don't know how much your knowledge of the Electronic Registration Information Center is, but that's kind of what I want to hit on right now, because at least 7 states have pulled out of this electronic registration to so-called improve our voter rolls. Do you see any concerns with ERIC?
Yes, in fact, I published a paper some months ago pointing out many of the problems with ERIC. I mean, just to give you one quick example, the whole purpose of ERIC is, excuse me, for states to share their statewide computer lists to find, for example, people who are registered in more than one state, for example, perhaps Georgia and Florida. But as we talked about before, excuse me, being a citizen is a requirement, and yet the ERIC membership agreement bars states when they're providing their statewide voter list and their DMV lists, which are also used to check this information, from providing any information that indicates the citizenship status of an individual, for example, who's got a driver's license. Why would you bar that information? That's relevant to whether someone should be registered or not. I understand why those states have pulled out. I believe they're working on an alternative, trying to set up an alternative that won't have some of these problems that Eric has, and I encourage them to do that.
Has the founder of Eric previously shared information with outside resources?
I'm sorry, what was that?
Has the founder of Eric, David Becker, has he been known to share information with outside election organizations?
Well, in fact, that's another issue that the withdrawing states haven't been able to get a clear answer to, and that is whether their confidential voter registration information has been shared with third parties, particularly third parties that might be using it for partisan purposes.
Would you agree with me that the highlight that's been put on voting today, it would be better to be decentralized and let local people like they used to go back and start cleaning up our voter rolls?
I think states, there are many, many things states can do to clean up their voter rolls. The one thing that they can't do on their own is the state of Georgia doesn't have the ability to get information on its own of who might be registered in both Georgia and Florida without the cooperation of Florida. So some kind of agreement needs to be there for the sharing of data. There used to be a second program that did that. It was called the Kansas Interstate Crosscheck Program, but it was driven out of business by lawsuits filed by the ACLU and others who didn't want a rival to Eric.
And that happens a lot, not just in that, but in the next thing I want to talk to you, and thank you, I'm running short. Ms. Narudin, tell your son thank you for his service, first of all. Dominion machines. Georgia's got more than any other state in the union, I believe. Probably about 10,000. Is it cheaper to use Dominion machines or paper ballots?
Microphone.
I would have to say it's probably 10 times more expensive to use those Dominion machines. As a small county, they only had one polling precinct until Mr. Spakowski clearly hit the nail on the head and we got sued and we had to open up more polling places and we didn't get any more extra voters in the 2022 election than we did 2020. We had to go out and spend extra money on all those new Dominion machines, which now has not been updated, and there's clearly a cyber security threat with those machines because there is a patch that they want you to implement and nobody wants to update them in Georgia.
To answer your question, if I may, sir.
You can, the witness can comment.
Yes, thank you. Fulton has over 830,000 registered voters, and I think that there would be a challenge conducting a paper ballot election for Fulton in particular. You know, as far as the cost of it, I don't know, but I will say that comparing Fulton to a county with 10,000 people is just not fair.
We've got 28,000.
28,000, okay.
I yield back, Mr. Chairman. I got a lot more questions, but I'll yield back.
The gentleman's time's expired. I now recognize myself for 5 minutes for the purpose of asking our witnesses questions. I will note that after the passage of SB 202, apparently Georgia's won a World Series with the Atlanta Braves, and the University of Georgia won 2 national football championships. So I can't believe that there's any state in the country that's not trying to pass voter integrity legislation. I say that as a firm believer in the University of Wisconsin and a Brewers fan. But in a serious sense, as we look at the impact that SB 202 had here in Georgia, as we think about the American Confidence in Elections Act, the ACE Act that we've introduced today, I want to go back, if I can, Dr. Ruth, with you, and look back at a University of Georgia survey that they did after the election. In particular, it asked people about whether or not they faced voting problems. In particular, we had a lot of conversation about underrepresented minority groups and some of the challenges that they may face. In that survey, do you know what it said as it related to African Americans who faced, quote, no voting problems?
Just to give a little background, that the UGA survey, the UGA surveys 1,253 registered voters. 64% voted early, 30 voted on Election Day. And it is true that 0% of African Americans responded that they had a poor voting experience.
That's a pretty positive thing after we were told that SB 202 was Jim Crow 2.0 by the President of the United States. Following analysis of that data and your knowledge of the Georgia election law, do you believe that SB 202 was truly Jim Crow 2.0?
I do not.
You do not. I think that's really important because it's easy to have false narratives thrown at election integrity legislation like the ACE Act. But when we examine the underlying empirical data, often we're finding that those narratives are false and are simply trying to scare people from passing strong voter integrity provisions that at the end of the day increase voter turnout. And so if I can jump to you, Ms. Nuruddin, is we look at the turnout in the 2022 election, was the turnout rate in Georgia higher than the national average?
I believe it was.
Yeah, it was 57%. The national average was 52%. So following Georgia passing an election integrity bill and implementing that bill, Georgia's voting at a higher rate than the national average. To me, giving further evidence that passing election integrity actually enhances individuals' confidence in their elections, and as a result, more people are participating in the process as they have confidence in the elections. If I can go back to you, Dr. Ruth, on something we talked about as related to ballot drop boxes. In Georgia before COVID, so go back to 2018 and before, were ballot boxes legal in the state of Georgia?
No, they were not.
They were not. And then following the passage of SB 202, ballot drop boxes are now legal. There's rules and regulations around them, but they're now legal in the state of Georgia. Is that accurate?
They are.
So it'd be fair to say that SB 202 actually increased the use of ballot drop boxes in the state of Georgia, did not decrease them in the state of Georgia.
Yes, that's correct.
Yeah, I think that's pretty important. And then if I can come to you, Mr. Benz-Pekovsky, looking at President Biden's executive order, it's 14019, because I know you're a numbers guy and in the details, quote, promoting voting access, end quote. It requires federal agencies to do a lot of things, but it does a lot of stuff that really is partisan election work. Do you have concerns that federal agencies would be using federal taxpayer dollars to engage in partisan elections?
Yes, and the problem with that executive order was that the president had no constitutional statutory authority to start directing federal agencies to not only engage in voter registration activities, but also was telling them to help voters obtain and vote their absentee ballots. I mean, that's outlined in the executive order. And this is so potentially confusing to voters and to state election officials that a number of secretaries of state protested this, saying you are going to confuse our voters. And just one other thing on this, Mr. Chairman, I think is very important. Individuals who are members of the public who are applying, for example, for benefits, vulnerable members of the public, veterans benefits, Social Security disability benefits, and suddenly the federal clerk they're dealing with says, oh, by the way, you need to get registered to vote. Oh, and can I help you with your absentee ballot? What are those vulnerable members of the public to think? Boy, I better do this. I better vote for the...
You and I, Mr. Pekovsky, share the same concerns on this, that when you allow the federal government to use federal taxpayer dollars for election partisan purposes, there's a whole host of concerns. Let me come back to one final point that I think is really important. Our bill prevents that, might I add. But as we look at funds coming into elections under the guise of charitable entities, 501c3, 501c4s, the risk in particular of Zuckerbucks or of nonprofit entities getting involved in electioneering, I have grave concerns with. Another thing that I have real serious concerns with is foreign money coming into U.S. elections with the loophole of charitable entities. Does this bill clear up both the loophole of which currently it would allow Zuckerbucks to come through and obtain a tax-free advantage? This closes that, correct?
It closes it, and this is a needed change in federal law.
And then the second one that it closes is prevents a foreign actor, a foreign person, a non-citizen from putting money into a U.S.-based charity, which would then be transferred to a super PAC to then do the bidding of a foreign actor. Is that accurate?
Yeah, that is accurate, and again, that is a needed change.
I think at a minimum, those are two things that my colleagues across the aisle should be supportive of. I think those are absolutely critical reforms. I'm going to now yield back to myself before we close this hearing. Just want to say thank you to all of our witnesses for being here. Thank you to our audience. I think on the whole, we kept it in check as we were going through a pretty important topic. But I also want to give a big thank you to the staff and the students at Georgia State University. We just can't thank you enough for your hospitality today. I now recognize the ranking member.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I agree. I want to add my thanks to Georgia State and their beautiful facility here. And thank you to everyone who participated in trying to make this civil. We obviously have disagreements. But I come from Rochester, New York, which was the home of Frederick Douglass and Susan B. Anthony. The right to vote is our birthright as Americans, and we have to do everything we can to ensure that every American has the opportunity to vote. And I look forward to a bipartisanship coming together that we can eliminate the disparity between black voters and white voters and throughout American elections. Before I conclude, Mr. Chairman, I would like to seek unanimous consent the following be added to the record. First, a series of articles by Mark Neese, published in the Atlanta Journal-Constitution. There are several of them, and and the following expert reports filed in the consolidated lawsuits against SB 202, which demonstrate the law's discriminatory and unlawful impact on individuals of color. Expert reports by Dr. Carol Anderson, Dr. Bernard Fraga, Dr. Stephen Pettigrew, and Dr. Barry Burden. I'd like to ask unanimous consent to add those to the record.
Without objection, so ordered.
Thank you, sir.
For what purposes does the gentleman seek recognition?
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I also would like to submit something for the record. It was mentioned earlier today, as well as in this hearing, a Brennan study that made the claim that total turnout between 2022 and 2018 had decreased. I would like to submit for the record the actual Georgia Secretary of State's data that shows that voter turnout actually did increase between 2018 and 2022. However, white voter participation between 2018 and 2022 actually decreased. Non-white voter participation significantly increased between 2018 and 2022, and that is raw data from the Georgia Secretary of State's office.
Without objection, so ordered. Again, I'd like to thank our witnesses for being here, Georgia State University for hosting us today. Members of the committee may have additional questions for you. We'd ask that you please respond to those questions in writing. Without objection, each member will have 5 legislative days to insert additional materials into the record or to revise and extend their remarks. If there's no further business, I thank the members for their participation. Without objection, the committee stands adjourned.
Wait, but we're sitting. How can we stand adjourned?
The Committee on House Administration will come to order. I note that a quorum is present. Without objection, the chair may declare recess at any time. Also, without objection, the meeting record will remain open for 5 legislative days, so members may submit any materials they wish to be included therein. Thank you, Ranking Member Morelli, members of the committee, and our witnesses for participating in today's hearing. The purpose of today's hearing is twofold. First, it serves as a long overdue oversight hearing with the Elections Assistance Commission, or EAC. This is the committee's first oversight hearing of the Elections Assistance Commission since 2011. As chairman of the Committee on House Administration, I can assure you times are changing. I'm excited. We're committed to a robust oversight of our federal agencies to ensure we're protecting taxpayer dollars. Second, today's hearing will examine what improvements can be made to the EAC through the American Confidence in Elections Act to help improve voters' confidence that our nation's elections are free, fair, and secure. Congress serves as an important check on federal agencies to ensure they're fulfilling their purpose. The EAC was established to serve as an independent, bipartisan commission charged with helping voters participate in the electoral process and to help confirm election officials improve the administration of elections. Following the 2000 election, Congress decided that election administration problems were big enough that a new federal agency needed to be created. In its first 6 years, the EAC doled out $3 billion in federal taxpayer dollars in grants to states and has spent billions since. While some states have used the money effectively, we know some states have not. As part of the CARES Act, the EAC received $400 million in additional grant funding to prepare for the 2020 election cycle. The GAO found that the EAC is unable to account for the full $400 million due to poor accounting policies. The GAO also found that EAC conducted minimal oversight. The reporting made, quote, it difficult to determine how grant funds were spent across states, end quote. The failure to accurately track how states use these federal grants has potentially enabled significant waste, fraud, and abuse. I'm also concerned that some states spent the funds for political purpose rather than improving election administration. Let's look at how California spent their 2020 funds. The state of California was awarded $35 million in federal funds. California spent the money on a Get Out the Vote campaign. The campaign targeted specific voters. The contract was awarded through an expedited process. The firm that was awarded the contract was SKD Knickerbocker. SKD Knickerbocker was Biden's campaign advisory firm. If you went to the company's website, you would see they listed themselves as part of, quote, Team Biden. If that's not a conflict of interest, I don't know what is. It's a violation of federal law to use HAVA grant funds for Get Out the Vote activity. The former EAC Inspector General stated that the contract between the California Secretary of State and SKD Knickerbocker presented a risk of improper use that required further examination. The American people demand more transparency and accountability in their government, especially with respect to election. Today, we'll bring much-needed oversight to the EAC to examine how we can eliminate waste, fraud, and abuse. In doing so, we can help improve voters' confidence in both the EAC and our election process as a whole. I'll now recognize the ranking member, Ms. Morelli, for 5 minutes for the purpose of providing his opening statement.
Good morning. Thank you, Chairman Stile, for welcoming us all today. I want to thank our witnesses for being here this morning. The role of the Election Assistance Commission, EAC, is a critical one. Every American must be able to cast their ballot freely, fairly, and securely, and to have their vote counted as cast. Voters cannot do that without the hard work of the officials and poll workers who administer elections, and EAC's support of these officials is crucial. The EAC was established more than 20 years ago by the Help America Vote Act, also known as HAVA, with broad bipartisan support. In the past 2 decades, the EAC has evolved to meet its mission and to adapt to new elections landscape. We should maintain the spirit of bipartisan support through all of this. As election-related mis- and disinformation has grown, voters bear a growing burden of having to sort fact from fiction. A trusted clearinghouse of information and resources such as the EAC is invaluable to providing voters with resources they urgently need and ensuring election officials have the tools to educate voters and conduct safe and secure elections in an ever-changing environment. The EAC provides assistance as election officials face growing threats and partners with other federal agencies to address critical infrastructure needs. In recent years, we've seen attempts to undermine public trust and confidence in our elections and the electoral process. And while voter confidence has improved in the last couple of years, having a trusted messenger of election information is vital to our democracy. One of the most significant needs in election administration is robust and consistent funding. Since 2018, Congress has provided more than $950 million in HAVA security grants and $400 million in CARES Act funding, but more is needed. Indeed, President Biden's budget called for investing $5 billion over the next 10 years, and I fully support the President's budget request. Maintaining our democracy requires resources, and budgets reflect society's priorities. So we need to make sure that we're consistent about this because that reflects our support for fair and open and accessible elections. The need for funding is acute. Estimates for what it would cost to adequately fund elections over the next decade are in the billions of dollars. Billions of dollars. Despite being designated critical infrastructure in 2017, federal investment in elections is irregular, unpredictable, and insufficient. Simply won't do. We must provide sufficient, regular, and predictable funding for states and local election administrators through HAVA grants, as well as fully funding the EAC. As a ranking member of this committee and a member of the House Appropriations Committee, I look forward to working with my colleagues to provide an adequate amount of election funding as an investment in protecting democracy, empowering election officials to do their good work, and to improve and modernize federal elections. For years, the EAC was underfunded, targeted by my colleagues on the other side with measures to eliminate the agency. I hope we've moved on from the past days and can all agree that the EAC has a critical role in our electoral process. It should be equipped with the funding necessary to meet its mandate and the evolving needs of our election officials. I was heartened to hear in recent testimony from Vice Chair Hovland and Commissioner Palmer about educational tools the EAC has developed for election officials to utilize new programs the EAC is working on, such as the Field Services Program and the regular engagement of the Commission with state and local officials and other federal partners. I look forward to hearing from all the commissioners today about the work the EAC is doing with election officials around the country about the implementation of the updated guidelines for voting systems and how the Commission is preparing for the 2024 elections. Additionally, there is always room for program improvements. We all want to ensure taxpayer dollars are spent effectively and efficiently. I look forward to hearing from Inspector General Schlitz about opportunities for those improvements. Excuse me. The work we do now, laying a bedrock of education about the voting process, strengthening partnerships among federal, state, and local governments will further bolster voter confidence ahead of the 2024 presidential election. The 20 and 22 elections showed that our national democratic experiment can hold, but we must remain steadfast in our commitment to democratic principles as we head into this next election cycle. I look forward to hearing from our witnesses today, and thank you all again for being here, for the important work that you do each and every day. And with that, Mr. Chairman, thank you, and I yield back.
Thank you very much. Without objection, all members' opening statements will be made part of the hearing record if they're submitted to the committee clerk by 5 p.m. today. Today we have two witness panels. We welcome the commissioners on our first panel, and Ms. Brianna Schlitz, Inspector General of the Elections Assistance Commission, will participate on our second panel. Commissioners, we appreciate you being with us today, and we look forward to your testimony. Pursuant to paragraph B of Committee Rule 6, the witnesses will please stand and raise your right hand. Do you solemnly swear or affirm that the testimony that you're about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth, so help you God? Let the record show the witnesses answered in the affirmative and may be seated. I'll now introduce our first witness panel. Our first witness, Chairwoman Christy McCormick, was confirmed by unanimous consent of the U.S. Senate on December 16, 2014, to serve as on the U.S. Elections Assistance Commission. Chairwoman McCormick has twice served as chair and currently serves as the chairwoman of the EAC and is the designated federal officer for the Technical Guidelines Development Committee. Our next witness, Commissioner Benjamin Hovland, was confirmed by the U.S. Senate on January 2, 2019, and currently serves as Vice Chairman of the U.S. Elections Assistance Commission as the designated federal officer for the Local Leadership Council. With 20 years of experience in elections, Commissioner Hovland's career has focused on legal issues related to campaign finance regulation and the administration of state and federal elections, including recent poll worker training, voter registration list maintenance, statewide database matching, voter education, and ballot initiative litigation. Our next witness, Commissioner Donald Palmer, was nominated by President Trump and confirmed by unanimous consent to the U.S. Senate on January 2, 2019. Commissioner Palmer is a former Secretary of the Virginia State Board of Elections and served as the Commonwealth's chief election official from 2011 to 2014. He also previously served as Florida's state election director. And finally, Commissioner Thomas Hicks was nominated by President Obama and confirmed by unanimous consent to the U.S. Senate in 2014 to serve on the U.S. Elections Assistance Commission. Prior to his appointment with the EAC, Commissioner Hicks spent nearly 10 years at the Committee on House Administration, serving as Senior Elections Counsel and Minority Elections Counsel. We appreciate you being here today and look forward to your testimony. As a reminder, we've read your written statement and it will appear in full in the hearing record. Under Committee Rule 9, you're to limit your oral presentation to a brief summary of your written statement unless I extend the time in consultation with the ranking member. Please remember to press the button on the microphone in front of you so the members can hear you. When you begin to speak, you'll see a light that will turn green. 4 minutes, it will turn yellow. Then it'll turn red, and we'll ask you to wrap up. I now recognize you, Ms. McCormick, for 5 minutes for the purpose of making an opening statement.
Chairman Style, Ranking Member Morelli, and members of the committee, thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today to discuss the work of the U.S. Election Assistance Commission as we prepare for the 2024 elections. We appreciate the committee's crucial oversight efforts and close attention to the EAC. Our nation's elections have faced increased scrutiny in recent years, and the committee has responded by demonstrating leadership in helping to support election administrators. By conducting this important series of congressional hearings, the House Administration Committee has shined a spotlight on increasing America's confidence in elections. As you move forward and consider election administration reform, the EAC stands ready to assist and carry out the provisions of that legislation. It is essential that U.S. elections are conducted with integrity and transparency and are free, fair, and trustworthy. The bipartisan EAC works to uphold this charge each day. Over the past decade, the field of election administration has faced ever-growing challenges and the need for increased technology improvements to our election systems. Many of these challenges, including questions about adequate funding and security for voting systems, are not new. Others, however, have increased suddenly in recent years. For example, social media continues to evolve, with new platforms and generative AI tools making voter education more challenging. In addition to administering elections and voter education, officials must still prepare for cyber, physical, and personal security threats. Many election officials have left the field, citing safety, increased requirements and expectations, and a lack of resources. Some communities have seen their entire elections departments resign. Now more than ever, election officials need our support. With the help of this committee, the EAC is determined to do all it can to meet these challenges. Over the past year, commissioners have redoubled outreach by resuming travel across the country for in-person meetings, presentations, and visits with state and local election officials. Discussions during these visits underscored not only the outstanding work of election administrators in 2022 midterms, but also the significant impact of efforts by the federal government to provide guidance, monetary resources, and best practice materials. Election officials have expressed sincere gratitude for recent assistance, especially for resources dedicated to safety and security. This includes $955 million in HAVA security grants provided by Congress and administered by the EAC. With support from Congress in the form of increased agency operating budget and more consistent HAVA funding to the states, the Commission continues to fulfill the agency's mission to improve the administration of federal elections and to help Americans vote. As you are aware, the decentralized nature of U.S. elections results in a wide variety of practices, laws, and regulations. To support the country's multitude of election situations and meet HAVA's charge with developing election guidance, the EAC's Clearinghouse Division has generated a depth of informative products, including updated Quick Start guides, a new version of the Election Management Guidelines, which is a primary for election administration, guides, checklists, and one-pagers, white papers, simulation videos, toolkits, and other products to assist election officials. These documents reflect the need for unbiased, trusted source of guidance as election officials navigate the complexities of election administration. This is especially important now as we welcome and train the many new officials across the country. Earlier this year, the agency hired an experienced government leader, Stephen Frid, to serve as our new executive director. The EAC has also hired needed support staff to assist the election process, and specifically the role it plays as critical infrastructure. Additionally, the EAC marked the 20th anniversary of HAVA in 2022, commemorating the historic milestone with the launch of Help America Vote Day and the celebration of the second National Poll Worker Recruitment Day. With more than 3,000 counties and thousands of localities, it takes nearly 1 million poll workers to operate election polling sites. This process supports more than 209 million registered voters. The AC continues to strategically promote election worker information on social media and on our website. We created helpamericavote.gov, a permanent outreach platform in 2020 in service of the first National Poll Worker Recruitment Day. Over the course of 2022, the EAC's poll worker web pages had over 263,000 page views. We regularly receive modifications from election offices, and based on their responses, information is updated consistently. Looking forward to 2024, with ongoing support from Congress, the Commission will provide the necessary assistance to election officials to mitigate challenges and protect the integrity of U.S. elections. I'd like again to thank the committee for its oversight and support of the EAC, as well as for the opportunity to speak here today. I will now turn the discussion over to Commissioner Ben Hovland to discuss the Commission's internal financial oversight and grants management.
Thank you very much, Chairwoman McCormick. Vice Chair Hovland, you're now recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Stile, Ranking Member Morelli, and members of the committee for inviting us to testify about the work of the U.S. Election Assistance Commission. My name is Ben Hovland, and I'm the current Vice Chair of the EAC. A core component of the EAC's mission is distributing, monitoring, and auditing the use of federal grants for the improvement of election administration and security. Federal HAVA funds, including the $955 million provided since 2018, are a key resource for election administrators responding to increased technology and the changing demands of the field. To emphasize the importance and impact of this funding, I would note the election infrastructure sector-specific plan states, quote, "It is impossible to make an honest assessment of the election infrastructure subsector's risk and the potential to mitigate that risk without an understanding of the chronic resource issues the subsector faces at all levels of government," end quote. As we look toward 2024, I believe it has never been more challenging to administer elections or more expensive. That's why grant funding in partnership with the states is so crucial, and we value your efforts to address the needs of state and local governments through the congressional appropriations process. As of this March, 95% of the FY 2018 election security grant funds have been expended, including additional election security funds from FY 20, 22, and 23. States have spent a total of $529 million in funds awarded between 2018 and 2023, which is approximately 56% of the available grant funding. The spending rate depends on the state's planned use, with some states allocating the funds for long-term programs or resources. Some states provide these funds to local governments in the form of subgrants, while others rely on these funds for staff and materials at the state level. With each state's different security priorities and timetables for significant purchases, such as voting system replacement or new statewide voter registration databases, usage rates have varied across the country. The next expenditure reports are due to the EAC on July 30th. As set forth under HAVA, audits of election security grants are conducted after a state begins to expend the provided funds. Alongside distribution and administration efforts, the EAC's Office of Inspector General recently added resources and staff to better monitor state spending of election security grants. With new staff leadership in place, the agency is invested in building up staff capacity strategically across the agency. However, the EAC still faces significant attrition challenges. It's essential that we maintain adequate staffing levels in mission-critical functions to ensure statutorily mandated requirements are met. The EAC's Inspector General has raised structural issues related to HAVA that are discussed in her report on management challenges for the U.S. Election Assistance Commission in fiscal year 2023. My colleagues and I concur with those observations and have included them in our legislative recommendations. Of particular note, the inability to pay competitive wages compared to Congress or other federal agencies hampers our ability to attract and retain talent. We are, however, committed to doing everything we can with the resources we have. The EAC is grateful for the increased funding provided by Congress in recent years. After facing over a decade of significant fiscal constraints, the EAC returned to pre-2010 budget levels for the first time in FY 2023. For FY 2021 and 22, the EAC successfully adapted and executed the operating budget provided by Congress, ending each year with an obligation rate over 99%. Congressional funding has been fully utilized, enabling the agency to provide much-needed assistance to address some of the pressing challenges facing the election community. Thank you for the opportunity to testify before you today, and I look forward to any questions you may have.
Thank you, Vice Chair Hovland. Commissioner Palmer, you're now recognized.
Thank you, Chairman Stile, Ranking Member Morelli, and members of the committee. I echo my fellow commissioners in our appreciation of the investment you have made in the nation's elections through continued support of the EAC. In preparation for the 2024 election, the EAC will continue to test and certify the nation's voting systems and will continue, and the American public should be confident that their ballot will be counted. In 2023, the EAC will advance our testing and certification efforts in several areas. A voting system certification does not end with a successful test in an accredited laboratory. Rather, the review of these voting systems continues during the lifespan of the voting equipment. As a result, the agency is preparing to launch an innovative field services program to help election officials strengthen their overall posture and preparedness with EAC certified systems. This on-site collaboration is important for several reasons. First, the implementation of system reviews in the field will ensure that equipment delivered to jurisdictions is equivalent to what was purchased. The effort will analyze system hardware and software configurations to verify the equivalency of the equipment to EAC certifications. Additionally, there will be jurisdiction site surveys of voting systems, the best practices assessments, collection of system census information, and analysis of anomaly reports. We recently onboarded the Field Services Program Manager and look forward to building out this initiative. In 2022, the Commission made considerable progress by fully operationalizing version 2.0 of the Voluntary Voting System Guidelines, or VVSG. The new guidelines incorporate technological advancements in cybersecurity, accuracy, accessibility, usability, and auditability. Adoption of the EAC's new life cycle policy, along with the accreditation of 2 voting system test laboratories, are necessary steps toward the realization of voting systems that are VVSG 2.0 tested and certified. The EAC has one system that is being currently tested against VVSG 2.0, and the commissioners just recently visited the ProV&V, the test lab, and got to see firsthand some of the testing that is going on in Huntsville, Alabama. We'd also like to take this opportunity to emphasize that VVSG 1.0 and 1.1 certified systems will not be decertified by the EAC as the result of migration to the new guidelines. Voting systems that are currently deployed are still accurate and reliable, may continue to be used, and do not need to be immediately replaced or recertified to 2.0. In addition, they will continue to be tested and updated with security patches. It will take time and significant monetary expenditures for jurisdictions to implement VVSG 2.0. So it's unlikely that systems certified to 2.0 will be used in the 2024 elections. Congress and the American people, though, should have absolute confidence in this process. The EAC has amplified this message by publishing a communications toolkit to assist election officials in communicating about VVSG standards, updates in election security, and helping to boost confidence in the critical infrastructure of our election systems. As part of our election technology efforts, the agency launched the Election Supporting Technology Evaluation Program, or ESTEP. This technology includes electronic poll books, electronic ballot delivery systems, election night reporting databases, and voter registration portals. These election supporting technologies are crucial tools for both election officials and voters. As more states and localities adopt these technologies, officials are looking to the federal government for voluntary standards and guidance similar to what is provided currently in the VVSG. Election administrators today must rely on a patchwork of state laws, regulation, and certification programs of varying degrees and review. An established EAC program will provide for the development of robust voluntary security standards, testing guidance, and training materials covering these election-supporting technologies. Attacks from nation-state actors against our election infrastructure have specifically targeted election systems, as I pointed out in the past, and these attacks are only going to escalate. So the first technology pilot for ESTEP is electronic poll books, and these are critical election supporting technology for election officials as they're used in the polling place. As the cybersecurity threat landscape across the election community continues to evolve, the EAC is planning a voluntary coordinated vulnerability disclosure program. The EAC will lead a program to quickly identify and respond to vulnerabilities in our voting system alongside our federal partners. Development of this program is in its preliminary stages and will require staff and resources to be fully realized. I would like to thank again the committee for allowing us to speak with you today. I will now turn the discussion over to Commissioner Tom Hicks to further expand on the Commonwealth's wealth of clearinghouse products, further briefly mentioned by Chairwoman McCormick.
Thank you, Commissioner Palmer. Commissioner Hicks, you're now recognized.
Thank you, Chairman Stile. Is it on? Okay. Ranking Member Morelli and members of the committee for having us here today. My name is Thomas Hicks. In addition to the developments my fellow commissioners have shared, the agency has also invested in increasing our clearinghouse capabilities. The EAC's Clearinghouse Division, composed of former election officials and subject matter experts, help the agency share and develop resources for both the public and election administrators. In this role, the EAC serves as a trusted source of nonpartisan election information, especially in the ever-evolving election landscape as the field of election administration continues to see high levels of turnover. Leading up to the 2024 elections, the Clearinghouse Division has released more than 60 products over the past 2 years, including a wide range of best practices and toolkits. Topics range from resources on physical security threats against election officials to EVE's data collection and analysis. Clearinghouse products offer overall guidance to new election officials in conducting elections, such as improving chain of custody procedures, auditing, and better serving voters with disabilities. This includes our new election management guidelines, updates with increased focus on relevant election technologies that have changed since the last release 15 years ago. All of the products developed by the Clearinghouse Division are guided by the parameters set forth in HOVR. We have heard from election officials across the country about the escalation of threats their colleagues, and poll workers have faced. The agency has developed and distributed clearinghouse resources and information from other federal partners, such as our dedicated landing page, as well as issuing guidance with the Election Security Grants Assistance. Another issue of concern are risks to the supply chain. While specific rules relating to paper ballot ordering are determined at a state level, there are areas where the Clearinghouse Division can provide guidance moving forward, particularly in the event of an emergency. In the summer of 2022, the EAC released an alert about the nationwide paper shortage and guidance on how to plan for depletions of paper inventory on Election Day. Additionally, states may use HOVR election security grants funding for procuring ballot stock that has security features such as watermarks and unique ballot identifiers. Our grants team also issued guidance on this matter. The EAC will publish the 2022 Election Administrating and Voting Survey, or EVES, at the end of this month. This biannual report collects data on election administration from nearly 6,500 local election jurisdictions across all 50 states, the District of Columbia, and the U.S. territories. EVES data is utilized by countless stakeholders in the election community. The EAC also remains committed to election officials fulfilling the requirements of the Americans with Disabilities Act and HOVR's promise of a private and independent vote for all eligible Americans. We've hired a full-time subject matter expert for accessibility to lead these efforts. The EAC is working on a national study to document the experience of voters with disabilities in the 2022 midterms. The survey will be released this summer. The Commission intends to use the results to produce actionable items that are necessary to meet HOVR's vision of fully accessible elections. Our other voting accessible resources include toolkits, for in-person voting, voter registration, vote by mail, and assistance for voters with language access needs. These language resources were updated following the most recent update to Section 203 of the Voting Rights Act requirements, which requires 333 jurisdictions to provide language assistance. With the 2024 election cycle already here, election officials face an ever-growing list of responsibility and challenges. The EAC is working diligently to help them prepare for the expected and the unexpected to provide the best voting experience possible for every voter. Thank you for the opportunity to share some of the work of the EAC and your commitment to election administrators, poll workers, and voters. There's still a lot that needs to be done, and we look forward to working with you on these issues. Thank you for the opportunity to testify today, and I look forward to answering questions and feedback you may have.
Thank you, Commissioner Hicks. We thank all of our witnesses for being here today. I'll begin our questions today, followed by the ranking member. We'll then alternate between sides. I now recognize myself for the purpose of questioning our witnesses. We'll hear from EAC Inspector General Schlitz soon on the recently submitted OIG semi-annual report to Congress. Commissioner and Chairwoman McCormick, you submitted a response to that report 2 weeks ago stating that you were pleased that the California audit recommendations have all been resolved and closed. The audit was conducted because California awarded a $35 million contract through an expedited process to Joe Biden's main election advisory firm. This doesn't inspire confidence that our funds, EAC, has responsibility over being properly used. And relating to the funds, the EAC budget 5 years ago was $9 million. In 2024, budget requests asked for almost $34 million, a roughly $25 million increase from just 5 years ago, and almost 300% increase in funds. Commissioner McCormick, has the EAC's jurisdiction increased since its creation under HAVA in 2002?
Only by the addition of the Northern Mariana Islands, Chairman Stile, but we do have increased work on the Commission. There has been an expansion in the concern over cybersecurity. We do have a lot more work to do to train election officials across the country. We do have increased responsibilities with grant management and making sure that the grants provided by Congress are appropriately used. We were also concerned about the California contract between SKD Knickerbocker and the California Secretary of State's office. In fact, we received several letters from this committee, and we also asked our Inspector General to look into that contract because of the concern of the inappropriate use of HAVA funds for get out the vote and voter registration activities.
Commissioner McCormick, I mean, if we look at the website, I mean, SKD Knickerbocker, I mean, this wasn't overly complicated. I mean, you go to their website, and it is Joe Biden for president. They're their SKD is proud to be a part of Team Biden. They're taking $35 million of federal taxpayer money to run an election. They run an expedited grant process, and the grant process can't be for get out the vote. It's got to be to properly administer their elections. And they gave $35 million of federal taxpayer money to someone that's a proud member of Team Biden and expected that the American people should have confidence that there's not political gamesmanship in this grant?
We agree with you, Congressman. This is not an appropriate use of HAVA funds, and that is why our Inspector General, our new Inspector General, came in and did an investigation and audit of those HAVA funds that were provided to California.
But what did we do about it? The $35 million went to California, was spent.
Well,
what's the ramifications for spending $35 million to a proud member of Team Biden?
Well, the Inspector General's office found that the money that was used for those activities was actually state funds and not HAVA funds. So the inappropriate use of those monies was not by federal funds. It was utilized by state funds. And she resolved that investigation and closed that question out. However, that does mean we still remain concerned about how HAVA funds are used and whether they're being used appropriately, documented appropriately, and whether they're can be reconciled with the plans that the states provide to us on how they're going to use the funds.
And so I read your written testimony. In your written testimony, you note that you're going to use some of this increase, the $25 million increase that you're requesting, to enhance the auditing and oversight of the grant making. How big is the team now? How big is it going to be? What are your needs in that respect?
Well, we have several members we have maybe, I think, 3 members in our grants division right now. We hope to expand that. We also are expanding, the Inspector General is expanding her team as well. And, you know, we need to have more resources to be able to have appropriate oversight. One of the issues that we have is that we have a short timeline when we do get this money from Congress to get that money out to the states. But that doesn't excuse us not overseeing those funds appropriately, and it takes resources to do that. And we appreciate that Congress has provided that to us.
So in 2022, you had 49 employees. It grew last year to 65. The request is to take it to 87, almost doubling in just 2 years. And so as we think about the new 16 people that you're looking to bring on, you referenced increasing and improving the audit and oversight. Are there other specific things that they're going to work on?
Well, we have personnel that we're trying to place into the field to do field services, following up on the testing and certification program. Right now, we have no visibility of the voting systems once they leave our laboratories. We plan on hiring field service auditors to go out into the country and to make sure those machines stay up to date and are still meeting the certification requirements, and to assist election officials in any kind of issues that they have with maintaining their voting systems.
Okay, I'm going to go back because I pulled up while you're speaking, the Office of the Inspector General report that according to SOS, 11.8 million in EAC HAVA funds were used for SKDK contract, 9.9 million of which were CARES Act funds and 1.9 million of 2018 consolidated funds. I just think it's broadly concerning to the American people when we see the appearance of political activity with federal taxpayer dollars, and we're looking for an increase in your budget. You're overseeing a lot of the grants that are going out to the states. Some of our states are using these funds in productive and thoughtful ways to better administer elections. The reason I'm pushing back is because some states aren't, and I'm uniquely concerned about this contract with California, where they gave it to, all you had to do is go to their website, and they were self-listing themselves as a proud member of Team Biden. I think that should be concerning across the board. I appreciate all of our commissioners being here. I will now recognize the ranking member, Mr. Morelli, for purposes of asking questions.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. A couple of things I just point out. I do want to correct the record. I believe EAC commissioners were here in May of 2019 on the question of election security, not 2011. So I just wanted to make sure I made that point. And I must admit, as much as I appreciate you holding up the Joe Biden for President sign, in fact, you could hold it up behind me, Mr. Chairman, I do want to just take a moment. I only have 5 minutes, but I do want to, first of all, submit, with unanimous consent, like to submit a copy of the Inspector General's actual report on the issue that's being talked about. It's dated February 9, 2022, and it comes from Inspector General Schlitz, and I just want to, I'll read at least, well, a couple of things I do want to note since we're going to spend some time here apparently talking about this. First of all, the contract was not sole sourced. It says that in the Inspector General's report. It actually, a number of firms bid on the work, and SKDK was one of the vendors chosen. But as it relates to the conclusions of the Inspector General, first of all, in the first part, federal funds were not used for registration drives. California launched a public education campaign called Vote Safe California. It indicates that nothing that SKDK, I'm going to get that right, did not violate anything in that regard, nor did the contract. And as it relates to get out the vote, it said the EAC grant funds for messages educating a specific population about safety voting during the population is allowed. Similarly, EAC said an advertisement directing the public to California's voting website is allowable because the website has additional educational information on how to vote safely or procedures for voting. So we found no specific activities or messaging that met the definition of get out the vote. And it concludes and this is the important part, I would think, the operative part, the conclusion by the Inspector General is based on the evidence. California Secretary of State Office executed the SKDK contract in accordance with EAC guidelines, and funds were not used for unallowable costs such as registration drives or activities meeting the definition of get out the vote. So I just wanted the record to reflect. We can talk about this, I suppose, all day long, but the actual Inspector General who you're referring to basically concluded that they had followed all the rules California had, and there's no there. So I want to just make sure that enters in the record with
without objection,
unanimous consent. Using just my last few minutes, perhaps Commissioner Hicks, our elections environment is constantly changing. Election administrators deal with ever-evolving cybersecurity threats and the rapid spread of mis and disinformation. We need to consider the physical safety of election workers and now must respond to an increasing number of records requests, analysis requests, and respond to the threat AI may pose to us all, and on top of that, actually run elections. Could you please comment on how increased and reliable funding could alleviate some of the significant burden?
Thank you, Congressman, for that question. Increased funding, when we go to election offices, the number one thing they ask for is additional funding. It's usually one or two people in the office that is trying to do 9 different jobs in an office, and so they are looking to the chairman had asked a little bit earlier, have we increased our authority? We haven't increased our authority, but the scope of our jobs have increased in terms of cybersecurity issues that no one thought of in 2003 or 2002 when HAVA was enacted, but also the fact that we are also fighting nation states in terms of mis and disinformation. And it's not really feasible to ask a city clerk in a small town to fight against a superpower for mis and disinformation when the U.S. government should be doing that. So we have worked with our partners, with the federal government, that being the DHS. When elections were elevated to critical infrastructure, we were able to do a lot more things in that sort of realm. But I do believe that with increased funding and increased responsibility, we will have to be able to do that so that votes can be counted accurately.
Very good. I had a number of other questions, but my time is going to come to an end. But before I do that, Mr. Chairman, I also ask unanimous consent that the Bren Center's June 2023 voting laws roundup, which found between January 1 and May 29th at least 11 states have enacted 13 restrictive laws, including 7 that curb access to mail voting, and an onerous law in Florida which would significantly reduce voter drives in advance of the 2024 election.
Without objection.
Thank you. Mr. Chair, I yield back.
The gentleman yields back. Mr. Loudermilk is recognized for 5 minutes.
Hit the wrong button. All right. Thank you, Mr. Chair. Thank you to each of our panelists for being here today. Chairwoman McCormick, last year in 2002, the EAC received $75 million in election security grants. In 2024, the EAC has requested $300 million in election security grants. Now, my calculation, that's about a 300% increase. Now, I know the entire nation has been affected by the out-of-control Bidenflation that we have right now, but I don't even think that's at 300%. That leaves us to question, what are these grants going for, and can you explain such a massive increase?
Thank you for the question, Congressman Loudermilk. The EAC itself is not requesting that money for our operations. We constantly hear from states and localities of the need for additional funding. And part of that is they are in the process of purchasing